to bid everyone welcome. We have a lot of people today, which is really nice. And of course, in particular, bid Thomas welcome, who is here to present. Thomas will present on, sorry, I'm keeping an eye on the people entering the room as well. Yeah,
I'll do that, Peter. You focus on master certainly.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Yes, I'll just remind everyone that we'll have a presentation from Thomas now, and then some time for group discussion and comments, and finally a summary from Carl. Yes. And I simply forgot the title of your presentation, Thomas.
Introduction to Attention Field Theory, a topological framework for modeling subjective dynamics. Subjective attention dynamics.
Thank you. And my apologies. What I wanted to say was Thomas is here to present on attention field theory and its relation to active inference and the free energy principle. So thank you, Thomas, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Professor Friston and the chairs for so generously inviting me. This is really exciting. I have looked forward to this ever since it was scheduled, and perhaps before. And yeah, in respect of your time, I'll just go ahead and jump right into it. So let me share my presentation. Just a moment, make sure I can see you all. Okay. Everybody can see that? Great. So the title, I changed it slightly. I apologize for that. But now it's called Introduction to Attention Field Theory, a Topological Framework for Modeling Subjective Attention Dynamics. And it used to say in active inference. And I switched it so it says mirroring FEP and active inference underpinnings. Again, my name is Thomas Anderson, and I'm a co-founder of a new company called Biosonos, developing technologies for using sound and vibration for therapeutic purposes. So first of all, I would like to dedicate this presentation to my thesis advisor, the late, great H.J. Caulfield, who often reminded me that we don't experience the world, we experience our model of the world. And this is something you are all quite familiar with. And this was a truth I was quite slow and reluctant to accept. And really, I've come to realize that so much of what I'll be sharing today is things that I learned from him very slowly after he passed, after the fact, only realized lately that he was teaching me this stuff all along, and I'm simply applying it in ways that are potentially novel and hopefully useful. So the objectives and flow of my presentation briefly, I'll introduce the model and illustrate how it appears, at least from my naive perspective, to align with both phenomenology and active inference principles, highlight some of the real world utility for therapeutic and practical contexts, and most importantly, and this is why I will move relatively rapidly, is inviting discussion and collaboration. I'm really looking forward to discussing these things with you all. I reached out to Professor Friston hoping to have a conversation with him because it seemed to me that this framework mirrors active inference principles very clearly. And instead of having that discussion privately, invited me to give this presentation. So some of what I will be presenting is very solid in that it's proven to be practical as something of a heuristic for practical purposes that I'll get into later. And some of it is provisional in that I have seen lots of very natural mirroring of the free energy principle and active inference principles in it. And I'm here to find out from you experts if my intuitions about that are correct. Quickly, the presentation flow, I'll start with some of my background. I'll be as brief as I can, but it actually helps give a picture of where this came from and how it developed and where I'm coming from. Some of the premises, the basis of the model, key components, applications, FEP links, and then, of course, open questions. Pardon, some of my slides are a bit word heavy, but that's in part because I also I forgot to do this in advance, but plan to share the PDF of these slides with you all. So they're a little bit more word heavy than what I will actually speak. So again, it's a little bit helpful to hear some of my background because I have worked outside the academic domain since I finished graduate school. And so none of you are familiar with me other than some brief correspondences I've had. So my background, in short, is music. I've been a musician my whole life and a professional musician my whole adult life. I studied mechanical engineering and then switched to physics, largely due to the fact that I wanted to understand these phenomena I was experiencing in my meditation practices that are commonly called qi. We'll get into that later. I was really blessed and realized that it was just great luck. I happened to get to be the last student of Dr. Caulfield. Due to my peculiar academic path, I managed to have a graduate program where I got to choose most of my classes because I had already completed all the graduate coursework or most of it before I finished undergraduate school. So I got this really extraordinary blessing to just get to study the topics of my greatest interest, being including chaos and complex dynamical systems, holography, neural networks, artificial consciousness modeling. And my thesis was on the holographic principle, which was at that time kind of a fringe piece of physics, and now it's become much more central. Black holes hadn't even been observed yet at that time, so it was provisional for sure. Also, my whole adult life has been largely built around practice and study of Qigong and various other meditative therapeutic arts. And I'll explain a little bit of some of that as we proceed. And sound therapy, using sound and vibration to achieve therapeutic outcomes. And in the background of all of this, I've been striving to find a way to model these experiences, typically called qi, in a way that's genuinely coherent, that fits the facts. And that is a lot of what led to this framework. Very briefly, this journey, I started practicing meditation while I was in engineering school and had these profound, unusual, palpable, tangible, and repeatable experiences. And I found out that they're called qi in Chinese and other languages, and there's lots of words for it around the world. And it's generally translated as some kind of vital energy or subtle energy. And I grew to believe that that is not a good translation, and that translation itself is actually part of the problem of trying to understand these experiences that are definitely real. I became a devoted apprentice of a Qigong master. I got very deep into it and also simultaneously studying physics. Became convinced that Qi is not energy. It just doesn't fit with what energy means. There's a common saying in Qigong, which is where attention goes, Qi flows. So I'll briefly, just very quickly say what is Qigong, because I haven't mentioned that and you might not be familiar. It's a broad class of practices rooted in Chinese traditions where you move something they call qi through your body and also through the space around you. And one of the common sayings in Qigong is where attention goes, qi flows. So essentially, the practice of Qigong involves fluidly moving your attention on purpose in fluid pathways, such as gathering your attention in your palm of your hand and then moving it slowly up your arm and down the other arm, usually synchronized with the breath. So that is generally framed as some sort of that feeling as being some sort of vital energy or subtle energy. And I'm convinced that that's not the case, but that it's definitely real. The outcomes of Qigong practices are very well verified at this point. So I started teaching Qigong in terms of attention flow and just leaving Qi out altogether. That you're moving your attention through your body, you're moving your attention through the space around you or through your model of the space around you. And that framing turned out to be incredibly successful. It leaves out all the hocus pocus, and what remains is the effective practices, and it's based simply around attention. And that has essentially led to I applying my dynamical systems modeling strategies that I learned in physics and engineering to this subjective experience of these key phenomena, whatever they might be. Eventually added a probability dimension to my modeling, and that essentially gave birth to the attention field theory. So a really nice way to begin understanding what attention field theory is to follow me through a series of questions so that the model essentially develops naturally in your own mind, because it's extraordinarily simple. The foundational assumption is that attention is a field within the domains of subjective experience. This isn't proposing, to be clear, I'm not proposing that attention is some sort of physical field, but rather that attention is like a field within the domains of our subjective experience, or rather within our model. So a field-like phenomenon within the model that is our total domain of conscious or subjective experience. Some key features to notice about your attention as it flows through the space of your awareness is that it's dynamical, it's always changing. Varies in intensity. It's located here or there on this or that. You can put your attention on the lamp in front of you. You can put your attention on the things I'm saying. You can put your attention on the memory of your grandmother's nostalgic vibe. You can put it all, you can move it around. It has location, but not just spatial location. Location in the domains of our subjective experience. It also varies in its focus or diffusion, and it has a complex distribution. It's not a simple beam. So that fundamental assumption naturally leads to some questions, or naturally led to some questions in me. And the series of questions and that assumption together paint something of a caricature of the development of this model. That's not exactly how it proceeded, but it cartoons it well enough to get the idea. So a question that naturally follows, where is this field? And the answer is in our model of the world, which includes our model of ourself. This field exists in our model, not in physical space, which it's suddenly moves us away from the traditional framings of some sort of vital energy into something that's more coherent with what we know about neuroscience. So what is the nature of this model space in which our attention dynamics occur? Some notable features are the dimensions. This is a proposal that really makes the model kind of simple in work, that the dimensions are attendable contrasts and distinctions. Attention naturally flows within the space of that which is attendable. It's non-Euclidean, that's for certain. It's curved, it's non-local. Attention can go from here to there within our model without some apparent path in between. It's dynamical, always changing. Dimensions come and go. We learn new distinctions, we forget distinctions, they come and go. So the dimensionality itself is always changing. It's nested or hierarchical. There's dimensions within dimensions. It's coupled. Dimensions are more or less coupled with each other. And the space itself is warped by attention. Attention carves paths through this space. Where attention goes, attention is more likely to go again. And we'll get into all these parts in more detail, but probably they're all pretty straightforward and obvious to you. Some more questions that naturally rose. How do we account for apparent dualism, subjective, objective distinction? And this is one of my favorite parts, and we'll get into this in more detail later, but a notion of dimensional privacy, that some dimensions are private, observable by only one observer. Some dimensions are shared, observable by more than one observer, or you might say confirmable rather than observable. And this leads to a really nice way of framing this spectrum from subjective to objective in terms of the number of observers who share those dimensions. And we'll go into that later. How do we account for observation versus imagination, memory, predictions, etc.? This required the introduction of a probability dimension. Some states of affairs are deemed by any agent or observer to be more probable or less than others, and that probability is dynamical. And although the probabilities of our subjective experiences are not numerical, they're vague. We can't say exactly how probable we expect, the cup of coffee to taste good, but we can say that they're clearly bounded between 0 and 1, which defines a hypersphere of radius p equals 1, which gives this natural, very comfortable and intuitive sort of closed space. The space, the model space in which our attention or conscious attention dynamics takes place in a sense within a hypersphere of radius 1 in the p dimension. Another question, where does information fit in? How are we informed? And the answer I suggest is surprise. Observing a less probable state of affairs is more surprising, more informing, and the converse. What guides and directs attention flow? In the simplest framing, attention attraction. Whatever attracts attention is that which guides it. Of course, it's more complex than that, and we'll go into that later. But a couple dimensions of attention attraction, or a couple of axes, are internal and external, intentional or unintentional. Another question, what power do we have over ourselves? What can we will, quote unquote? And I propose the answer I proposed is we can direct our attention. Everything else is a consequence, that it's the one power we have to proceed with doing anything we're going to do, is we can in some way or another direct the flow of our attention, more or less. How do we know what we are attending? This requires the notion of meta-attention, or some such thing, that attention can illuminate its own dynamics. And then a final question in this flow, this caricature of the development of the model, where is the math? Where are the numbers? Where are the equations? Being a good scientist, that's a good question to ask. And the answer I propose is hidden. Our subjective experience of attention dynamics is topological, not geometrical or numerical. And now I can give a much better answer. Where's the math? It's FEP, or active inference principles, which are in a sense presumably hidden underneath in the workings that are guiding and defining all of these processes I'm referring to. So core premises, we're going to now enter into what's the basic framework of attention field theory, the foundational framework, that attention is a dynamical field, I call it a field, illuminating, quote unquote, states of affairs in a high dimensional model space, M space, bounded in probability between 0 and 1. I want to take a note. I might have made this clear before, but I'm not sure if I did, and I want to make certain that this all was developed prior to my having any awareness of active inference or free energy principle. I came to all this essentially through following those questions in practical cases, applying these things to things like meditation and Qigong practice and so forth. And it's only recently, when I became aware of the free energy principle and active inference, that I recognized that these things seem to be remarkably coherent. And again, I look forward to getting your feedback about whether that's genuinely the case. The dimensions of M space are any attendable contrasts or distinctions, that which is attendable. Those contrasts that are attendable are the dimensions. The A field distribution in M space comprises our conscious awareness at any moment. The distribution of our attention is that which we call conscious awareness. And this is probably the most important part, that the A field and the space, M space, in which it is embedded are dynamically interdependent. Attention field dynamics reshape the space, and the space itself constrains and guides the attention dynamics, roughly in a sort of intuitive, metaphorical sense, somewhat like general relativity. And I initially tried to frame all of this in a general relativistic way, but that proved to be intuitively pleasing, but it has some drawbacks and overly complicates things. And then final core premises is just the premises that attention flows to that which attracts it. That attention is flow and this space is guided by attention attraction. And this comes from different directions. It can be internally driven or externally driven, or it can be intentional. We direct our attention on purpose, or it can be unintentional. The firecracker goes off and suddenly attracts our attention. And so those all form the much of the basic framework. So a kind of a question guides everything I'm going to present and guides my thoughts on these matters is given essential, as we consider essential features of phenomenology and the neurobiological and computational underpinnings of all these processes. For every such feature, we can ask ourselves, what would this look like within that core framework? So the core framework I presented, given that, then just start considering important features from both phenomenology and from neurobiology and free energy principle and so forth. And notice what would those features look like in that core framework? And this question essentially guides everything I'm going to share in the background. So I conceive it, and this may or may not be correct, but I conceive it roughly like this. And you have phenomenology and neurobiology, and they cross over. And here you have attention field theory. So briefly, 5 analogies for what kind of thing AFT is. I'll just jump into them. One, I conceive it roughly along the lines of something like Cartesian coordinates or phase or state space. It is striking and remarkable that it took so long for someone to create the Cartesian coordinates. But when Descartes did so, that very extremely simple maneuver, that simple framing, managed to unify algebra and geometry in a way that certainly helped fuel scientific revolution and so forth. And such is also the case for phase and state space. Plotting dynamical systems behaviors in these spaces reveals topological features such that we can better understand and control them in ways that weren't available prior to that very simple maneuver of plotting these things in state spaces and phase spaces. I don't want to be aggrandizing, and please don't take any of these analogies as such. Another what might appear aggrandizing analogy is the Bohr's model of the hydrogen atom. The comparison here is that this sort of simple, almost cartoon-like intuitive model managed to help unite our theory with our experimental findings. And of course, that model we know isn't really correct, but it nonetheless fuels our intuitions and helps spark the quantum revolution. And so that's another example. Another example is game physics. So you're playing, Super Mario Brothers or something. Within that space, what are the quote unquote physics in that space? How do things move? How do they interact? How does the space itself guide the movements of those things? And how do the movements of those things affect the space? And another analogy is relative to the spotlight model of attention proposed by Posner in the 80s. I was not aware, again, of this model when in the development of attention field theory, but in retrospect, I find that it's essentially can be framed as an evolution of that spotlight model. You're probably all familiar, but the spotlight model visualizes attention as an internal quote unquote spotlight shifting across the visual field, and items in the beam received enhanced processing. This model is intuitive and comfortable and kind of fun to think, but it also has some key limitations, and it's not incredibly useful in most cases. It's strictly spatial. It doesn't involve conceptual or emotional dimensions, for example. It lacks interdependence. It doesn't include anything about how the attention dynamics and the space in which they occur actually shape each other. It also involves an overly simplified distribution, fails to capture the complex, concurrent, nested allocations of attention and real subjective experience. And there's no probability involved, so it doesn't handle surprise or Bayesian updates. AFT evolves beyond these while maintaining a lot of the intuitive core. This is probably my favorite and perhaps the most useful analogy is attention field theory as a sort of user interface for FEP or active inference dynamics. This is a sort of a proposed flow. Suppose you have some intended changes in the organism state that can potentially be yielded through the intentional guidance of attention flow through one's model space. So the attention field theory provides a really nice way to frame our attention dynamics, which in turn are yield active inference dynamics. As our attention moves, there's active inference processes occurring under the hood, which yield real changes in the organism state. So I really like this particular analogy, and I think it actually might be what frames the greatest potential utility of this framing. So some core features, aspects of the framework, M space and probability. There's contrast dimensions, the dimensions that are attendable contrasts. They're dynamic, nested, and coupled. We'll get into each of those features as we proceed. And then a probability dimension that includes P equals 1 for observed states and P less than 1 for potential states that are, of course, updated by observation, and action as motor states flowing from P less than 1 to P equals 1. So one feature of the dimensions of this M space are that they are dynamic. There's immense phenomenological evidence for that. We form new categories and distinctions over time. We learn new faces, and older irrelevant ones fade or merge. From an FEP perspective, and anything I say about an FEP perspective or an free energy principle, please consider it all provisional and very admittedly coming from a naive perspective. I'm here to propose these things to get your feedback. That the brain's generative model updates with new data, adjusting its internal feature set, leading to emerging or dissolving dimensions as they prove more or less useful for minimizing surprise. In short, M space, the space is itself dynamic. It's not a predetermined space, but it's always changing. Also, the dimensions of the space are more or less coupled. Certain features in our experience co-vary or co-occur, such as color and shape defining the same object. Paying attention to a particular dimension can highlight or reinforce another. And from an FEP perspective, the model links distinctions that predict one another. Certain smell predicts a certain taste and so forth. And repeated co-attention strengthens these connections, forming higher order association. Implication being that the dimensions of M space are certainly not independent or strictly independent axes. They become more or less coupled, reflecting real-world correlations and attentional codependencies. Another feature of the dimensions of M space are that they are nested hierarchically, dimensions within dimensions. We see these hierarchies everywhere, letters to words, words to ideas, small shapes to larger patterns, fine-grained features into higher level categories, and so forth. I won't say anything about the FEP perspective because I know you are all familiar with the hierarchical nature of the generative model. And then the other component being this probability hypersphere. And this is where things get easier to picture, and some of the processes can be really intuitively thought about. The probability hypersphere, again, being the sphere from p equals 0, probability equals 0 to probability equals 1. This is, again, subjective probability. So it's really vague in here, but it's very well defined at the boundaries, the p equals 1 and p equals 0. So this is very naturally divided into two distinct regions: the surface at p equals 1, which would be states of affairs deemed by the agent to be now observed, which would serve as evidence, of course, for belief updating. And the interior, states of affairs deemed to be not now observed, such as memories, predictions, imaginations, concepts. These would be essentially beliefs about not now observed states. So one term I keep using is states of affairs, and by that I mean attendable patterns or features. And these are naturally divided into two class. I don't want to use the word classes. Divided into instances and classes. So instance being a particular state of affairs, which would be defined by a specific location in M space. For example, this red apple falling here, or a collection of interrelated instances defined by a broader region of M space, such as, for example, apples falling. And you all familiar with Bayesian perspectives are familiar with this, perhaps in different and more rigorous language. So probability updating has a very comfortable, intuitive way of imagining it in this framework. When an instance is observed, which is at the p equals 1 surface, its correlated class gets pulled outward as the evidence for this class being the case can be visualized in this framing as a sort of force or a pseudo force pulling its class upward or outward toward the p equals 1 surface. And a term I use in this framework is manifestation, being simply a transition from the interior of the hypersphere, p less than 1, to the surface. So when we observe some possible event, then it essentially makes a jump to the surface. And that jump essentially measures surprise in a very simplified way. A more surprising event is when it's observed makes a bigger jump because it was at a lower p value, and a less surprising event makes a smaller jump. This has an interesting relationship to quantum physics that's probably easy to notice. The collapse of the wave function framing of quantum physics has essentially this very same process. This gives us a really nice way to visualize this occurring. And of course, the surprise doesn't just depend on this radial magnitude of the jump. It also depends on distance in other dimensions. And it's more complicated because we're really dealing with probability distributions rather than this simple sort of units jumping to the surface. Nonetheless, for many practical applications, this simple framing is actually functional. Action in this framework is simply the same thing as manifestation in the motor effector dimensions. A possible state of affairs flows outward to the surface, that state of affairs being a possible action. And the links to free energy principle and active inference are probably already familiar to you. This is one of my favorite parts of attention field theory is this notion of private and shared dimensions, because it gives us what I believe to be an improved way of framing what is often a very vague distinction between so-called subjective and objective. That private dimensions being observable or confirmable by one agent, shared dimensions being observable or confirmable by multiple agents. So some obvious examples: private dimensions, hot, cold. A correlated shared dimension would be temperature reading. You and I both can confirm the temperature reading, but neither of us knows how hot or cold it is. This is something that happens in daily life for some of us. When somebody asks you, is it cold outside? I don't know how to answer. It depends on how cold it feels to them. Big, small, as a private version of spatial volume being shared, spicy, mild versus capsicum level, coarse, silky versus thread count. This is where this becomes, I think, most useful, is this allows us to define a shared dimensional order. I describe an n shared space being a space of dimensions shared by n agents or n observers. So for n equals 1, that would be what we call purely subjective. For dimensions that are only observable by that one agent. For n approximately 2, this could comprise such things as intimacy and inside jokes. So where two people's model spaces overlap in shared dimensions, the more agents there are, as n approaches infinity, we approach what we might call physics or objective reality. So you can frame this spectrum from subjective to objective in terms of this shared dimensional order. How many dimensions are shared by, or how many agents share the dimensions? When the dimensions are shared or observable or confirmable by practically every agent, then we have what we would generally call objective reality. That's the domain where physics lives, for example. But you could have, for example, what I would call a two shared space. So these two agents here both share these dimensions, but this other one doesn't know about it, and vice versa. These two might share some dimensions that this one doesn't know about. And then where they all three overlap, they all know about it, so to speak. I really, really think that this is a much more comfortable and useful framing than the general subjective objective distinction, which again is oftentimes very vague, especially when you're dealing with topics around consciousness and so forth. So we're another sort of, this is where things start getting a bit more provisional. We can consider communication in the context of mutual dimensional coupling. So suppose you have this is one agent. Oh, I need to be clear in this diagram and in the previous ones about the shared dimensions. This outer circle does not represent the p equals 1 surface, but it rather just represents the sort of container of the M space for that agent. So suppose you have agent 1 and their attention is moving in some private dimensions, and those dimensions are coupled to some shared dimension that are shared with this other agent. So for example, I am thinking certain things right now, and the things I'm thinking are coupled to the frequency content that's being transmitted through the computer networks and so forth. So here's these shared dimensions, which are the things you could measure, the things everyone could agree about, the things that could be recorded, the things that were so-called objective reality. Again, in this case, the words I'm speaking in whatever way you want to frame those. And those are in turn coupled to some of your private dimensions to which I have no access. And if these couplings are adequately similar, then we have successful communication. So if my private dimensions that are coupled to these shared dimensions are adequately similar to the private dimensions coupled to those same shared dimensions, then the communication is potentially successful. And this is the case for verbal, musical, communication, signs and symbols. And a question I hopefully will get to later is when considering whether attention field theory applies to non-conscious processes, could this also apply to, for example, shared stress among cellular subagents, potentially mirroring Mike Levin's notion of cognitive glue, if I understand it adequately. And now we definitely enter where these developments are new and are essentially, you might take them as sort of questions for you, the active inference experts. In the original framing of the attention field theory, I utilized an incredibly simple system I just called attention attraction, and mapped it on two classification axes, internal and externally sourced, and unintentional and intentional. And this is really helpful in practice for day-to-day occurrences and for a great variety of therapeutic practices. But as I've become familiar with the free energy principle and active inference, I realized that there is required a salience landscape of which I conceive as, in this framework, something along the lines of a scalar field in M space, or a potential field distributed across M space that marks how strongly each region pulls, quote unquote, the attention field, what direction it flows from where it is. And this is probably already familiar to you. And I realized that this should be naturally divided into time scales. And I originally had just two time scales, immediate and warping. And I'd like to give thanks to Chris Fields. I got to talk to him about these things a month or so ago, and he highlighted the need for at least three time scales, pointing out the homeostatic or affective deep drives need. And that actually has led to what seems to me to be an advancement in this model, and making it much better in accord with free energy principle. So thank you, Chris Fields, for that. So dividing these three time scales, one being immediate salience, ephemeral surges, sudden stimuli, or abrupt thoughts that spike the salience. And, the firecracker goes off and attracts your attention, but it doesn't last. Captures the A field and then fades quickly and loses strength quickly. And in FEP terms, high precision on acute surprises, reducing the free energy rapidly. It jolted me. In phenomenology, attention is forcibly directed and then let go. The second time scale being warping salience. And it is based on the warping salience that I originally tried to frame this in general relativistic terms, that where our attention flows, it warps the space through which it flows. So these are longer term wells formed by repetition or reinforcement, like skills, habitual thoughts, and gradual biases in well-worn dimensions. Habitual attendance warps the salience field, making it easier to re-enter. Second nature emerging over time, or in FEP terms and phenomenology, learned policies minimize surprise, precision builds around familiar patterns, or phenomenologically, always a hard word to say, automatic pull, the mind drifts back to practice states. And then the third class being homeostatic or affective salience, I'm calling it. These deep hidden drives, survival needs yield stable attractors. So this is a way I'm framing this. And again, I don't know, and I suspect that this isn't even the best way to frame it, but I'm presenting this because I wanted to discuss it with you, that each fundamental drive is something along the lines of a stable attractor near P equals 1 in hidden subdimensions, i.e. pre-conscious or subconscious or below the conscious level of the generative model. And these form something of a core scaffolding, and that these hidden attractors are mirrored as effective axes in the conscious model space in which the attention field theory refers. And I'll get into that in a moment. That deviating from the set points in the lower levels when we, are hungry or in danger, triggers the corresponding affective dimensions to essentially light up in the salience landscape, pulling attention until resolved. So this leads to this notion of an affective scaffolding in M space. I want to thank Mark Soames for stressing the centrality of categorical affect in consciousness, because first of all, Chris Fields pointing out to me the need for at least this third category, led to what seems to be a really useful framing, which is that in our M space, there are dimensions that are stable. So I mentioned many times before that the dimensionality of M space is dynamical. Dimensions come and go, but there are some dimensions that don't come and go. We are essentially born with them, or they develop quite rapidly. And these provide a stable structure or scaffolding to which the other dimensions couple. These So as new conceptual items appear, like the mother's face or a cozy blanket, they couple onto these existing affective dimensions. So the idea being here that M space is this dynamical, constantly changing space where dimensions come and go, except these core affective dimensions, which I believe, and hopefully Mark Soames will correct me if I'm wrong or improve upon this, that these core affective dimensions provide a foundational structural framework for this M space in which our conscious attentional dynamics take place. So I'm going to not say more about it because I think this will work much better in the discussion. I'm going to skip this valence because I honestly don't think I think that this should be discussed rather than proposed from my naive perspective here. I think that the people attending this discussion will do a much better job potentially framing what I was trying to get at here. But the foundation being that there are stable axes in this constantly changing space that we call I'm calling M space. That's the space in which our conscious attention dynamics take place. So valence, of course, I don't know if of course, but as you consider different effective axes, they come in different flavors, so to speak. There's polar, some of them extend from negative to positive. Some are center-based with negative at both extremes and optimal in the middle. Some are unipolar, so they go from, nothing to max, such as thirst, for example. And as new distinctions are learned, again, I'm proposing that they are coupled to these core dimensions. So dimensional coupling being very central to this framework. So what is the original coupling? So when a new dimension arises in an infant, to what might it couple? I propose that it couples to these affect axes, this core stable affective structure that defines M space from the start. And I've been reading Mark Soames' book, and it seems to resonate very well with this. Another very important feature of our conscious attention dynamics is meta-attention. And this is something that in my use of attention field theory in day-to-day life and in therapeutic contexts, I've just framed it in a very comfortable, intuitive way, just simply the fact that our attention can observe its own dynamics. But this seems to be capable of being made much more rigorous in the context of the free energy principle and active inference. But roughly at the top or near the top of the nested hierarchy, attention can see where and how strongly it's allocated. It involves noticing the effort and competition among subprocesses. So this requires that we have a map of our own M space and the attention dynamics therein so that we can observe those dynamics. And presumably this map that we're able to meta attend is of much lower resolution than the actual space itself. Presumably the meta attention would always also follows precisely the same kind of salience gradients, but aiming to minimize free energy, expected free energy in that case, because this would be looking at distinguishing different paths that could policies that we could take. So it requires temporal depth. So this is something that's also relatively provisional, but I think is interesting and potentially applicable. And I'm really interested in how this might or might not accord with active inference. Is that our sense of time, of pastness, or more clearly futureness, can be represented as the our observation of relative velocities of state. I guess velocities should potentially be in quotes, but velocities or speeds of states of affairs approaching the p=1 surface. So if a state of affair, if meta attention is capable of observing that states of affairs are moving outward, that the probability updating is moving it to the surface toward observation rapidly, then we deem that to be coming soon. And if it's moving toward the surface less rapidly, then we deem it to be coming later. And a question, of course, is can it work in the other direction as naturally, that states of affairs moving away from the surface, could that naturally represent our sense of pastness as much as this framing can represent futureness? So this leads to an interesting way to conceive Mike Levin's notion of a cognitive light cone being the spatiotemporal size of goals or intentions. That we can conceive the magnitude or size of that cognitive light cone as being proportional to the extent of how wide or complex are our attendable states. Roughly, how many dimensions can of M space do our intentions or goals include? If our goals include more dimensions, that would be a larger goal in this space. And then that would be crossed with or multiplied by the resolution we have on that changing probability. Back to the previous slide, the p dot being the relative rates that states are approaching that surface where they are actualized. There's a resolution, presumably, of how small of a change in p dot are we able to resolve. And if you cross these two, you get a nice simple framing of what might be the magnitude of our cognitive light cone. And intention is another important topic in the domains of considering conscious phenomena, and that would be when something goes from possible to chosen. A definition, a provisional definition, is that intention is a top level meta attention illuminating a potential state in M space, thus raising its salience in lower levels. By meta attending this not yet observed outcome, the A field effectively nudging it toward actualization. By illuminating it, we essentially, in this framing, lend a sort of force driving it outward toward the p=1 surface. And I won't get into these other parts because I think that the experts to whom I'm presenting will probably be able to expand or correct this if we get to it. And then, of course, an important aspect of conscious experience is will, the effortful top-down control. Will being, as I'm framing it here, essentially a meta-attentional push, resculpting salience. So our meta-attention applying an effort to resculpt the salience landscape below. This resculpting by meta attention being the effort involved, and will being the sculpting that salience such that our attention dynamics will flow toward that willed direction. So intention would be aiming at a future state, and will being the quote unquote muscle, so to speak, or effort that forces the attention to follow. So the effort of will, why do we feel will is work? Essentially that the re-sculpting of the salience landscape takes resources, and those resources being the effort that we feel as we apply this will. And again, this is all very provisional. This is me after having encountered the free energy principle and active inference, seeing that apparently it seems to me that all of these things rest naturally within this framework in a way that appears to me to be coherent with active inference principles. Another thing worth considering is what is trauma and what is trauma release in such contexts. Trauma formation might be framed here as overwhelming experiences creating an extremely negative subregion or negative affective, or a subregion of M space that's strongly coupled to a negative affect. Forming a deep well that attracts or potentially repels attention. The release process might be the safe re-exposure, essentially passing through it and then recoupling it, having the attention field pass through that region safely and recoupling it with neutral or positive affective dimensions. This corresponds incredibly well with Qigong practices and many other practices as well. Another thing that I have encountered a lot as I've been exploring the work of Mike Levin and other collaborators is the notion of competencies. And so I also wanted to present this. How would a competency be framed in this in attention field theory? It might be framed as something along the lines of a funnel-like attractor leading toward the surface. That the repeated practice warps local salience and forms a robust basin guiding potential states, P less than 1, to a stable skill realization, P equals 1. And the manifestation on the P equals 1 surface could be a point or a cycle or a small submanifold of quote unquote successful outcomes. This seems to be in alignment with FEP, mirroring well-honed policies and varying initial conditions converging to low surprise solutions. So that leads to one thing that Mike Levin often mentions is the rotation of competencies and the crucial role that plays in the evolution of intelligence. And in this framing that has this really intuitive, cartoony way of looking at it, is that essentially these funnel-like attractors that are, as I proposed, representing competencies being essentially rotated into new dimensions. So new dimensions of M space. So this would, it seems this would require a sort of decoupling of these salience attractors from the dimensions of M space, followed by a recoupling in new dimensions. This could alternatively be framed as the dimensions rotating into the attractors in the salience landscape. Nonetheless, it seems that this would call for a decoupling and recoupling process. And I hope to get some feedback on this idea. It seems that it could naturally and intuitively accommodate things like creativity, metaphor, and skill transfer, at least in some selected cases. So into some example applications. Again, my favorite is the user interface model for the free energy principle. Basically, what aspect of free energy principle dynamics can we control? Maybe there's others, but there's one that's very clear. We can control attention dynamics. We can internally control our own attention dynamics. We can focus on something on purpose. And externally, we can control other people's attention dynamics by grabbing their attention, repeatedly grabbing their attention, and then as much as we have a hold of their attention, guiding their attention in the direction that we choose. A lot of therapeutic practices are precisely that. And of course, so is verbal communication, such as is occurring right now. So attention field theory provides a user-oriented framework for guiding attention in ways that potentially leverage the FEP underpinnings. And also by applying AFT, we can co-model and design practices potentially that intentionally direct certain FEP dynamics or active inference dynamics for therapeutic and practical outcomes. So this is a proposed heuristic for this. Essentially, first, identify key dimensions and subspaces. For example, you might consider body space. This applies to the Qigong practices I referred to earlier. It's a subspace of our model. What is the domain in which we what's the domain of our body awareness? We could call that body space, being a slice, so to speak, of model space. Then identify coupling and warping of dimensions under consideration and map salience dynamics therein, and then trace attention dynamics in these spaces. So for example, in Qigong, you might move your attention from your head to your toes, back to your head to your toes. That's a very clear, simple to understand attention dynamic. But you can also have attention dynamics that flow within probability and so forth. And then hopefully in the future, if not now, identify the expected FEP or active inference outcomes. What will that do to the organism? And this is where I don't know if this is feasible yet or not. I know that these first 4 steps are already feasible and well-worn paths, but can we then identify active inference outcomes? What are the effects on the organism? So here's where we get into some of the ways I've utilized this already a great deal in my own life and practice, and also taught it to many students who have utilized it. For example, a great many different practices when framed in attention field theory follow a very simple flow that I call surface compression, where the attention is essentially compressed toward the p=1 surface. Perhaps the simplest, easiest to understand example of that is what is called trance drumming, where you play a beat, a steady beat, unchanging over and over again, like boom, 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 boom. And it keeps going and going and going and going and going. And if the person is attending it, if they're focused on it, the first beat is, has some surprise involved. So that beat essentially can be represented as making this larger jump to the p=1 surface from a lower initial probability value. The second beat is less surprising. The third beat's even less surprising. The fourth beat less and less. And as you follow this progression for a long time, the attention following each beat and getting surprised less and less, this can be naturally represented as essentially compressing the attention toward the p=1 surface, where the attention is no longer gathered into possibilities, fantasies, memories, and so forth, but it's gathered into the now, the very expected now, which is that beat happening again, just like it did a moment ago and just like it's about to. And trance drumming, which is a very common practice on, I think, every continent, most or many, or I'll say almost countless cultures. There are shamans who would drive themselves into alternate states of mind, would utilize trance drumming to achieve uh, special states. And so this is a really common practice. Another practice types of practices that are well modeled in such a way is mantra meditation, where you say the same word or phrase or syllable over and over and over and over again. Also, drone meditation, where you listen to a essentially unchanging sound. Present moment awareness, essentially, mindfulness practices, and also a lot of what we call flow states involves this sort of flow of the attention toward the surface, compression toward the surface. So another class of practices I called greasing the dimensions, where we guide attention through obstructed or habitually unattended pathways. So a Qigong practice, here's represented a very simple Qigong practice, where you gather your attention into your feet, then you move it progressively up through your body to your head, and then back down to your feet. And then again, you repeat up to your head, back down to your feet. You repeat over and over again. So you're intentionally guiding your attention through your body in these pathways. And this is constantly uncovering basically it in practice can be nicely described as quote unquote greasing the dimensions, that you're loosening those dimensions up. And of course, as the attention moves to those places, there are coupled dimensions, such as the affective dimensions. You have emotions that come up in your consciousness, into your awareness, when the attention passes through certain regions. And as you pass through those regions, you get the result is a freer flow. And this can also be done in lots of other ways, like touching tuning forks to the body progressively in different pathways. There's a whole bunch of practices that exist that can be nicely described in this greasing the dimensions. Pardon the phrasing, I probably should choose a different term, but Qigong and much of sound therapy, Yoga Nidra, which is a practice of alternating your attention through different sensations, hot, cold, heavy, light. There are some classic sort of scientific psychological practices such as EMDR, somatic experiences, and dialectical behavior therapy that involve a very similar process of shifting back and forth. An AFT explanation could be that you're warping the salience by repeated toggling, flattening negative attractors, and opening new attentional routes. I'm going to, just to make sure we get to the discussion soon enough, I'm going to skip reading these things. Again, I'm going to give everybody that wants them a PDF of all these slides. And again, some of them have far too many words for a presentation. This is another one I call carrot on a stick manipulation that involves two basic parts, hinting and blocking. So hinting is drawing someone's attention toward a desired outcome. That's dangling the carrot in front of them. And then they have an increased belief. The belief that they are going to get to eat the carrot is increased. So you have this movement of the state of affairs upward or outward toward the surface, and then you block it, you prevent its occurrence. And for example, you tell your employee, I'm going to give you a raise, and I'm going to give you a raise next week, but you just have to work overtime for free this week. And then you work overtime for free this week because you get so excited about it. And then you don't actually give them the raise. You tell them it's going to happen next week. So you keep drawing their attention to this expected state of affairs and keep causing this outward flow of that state of affairs toward the P=1 surface. And then you block it and give them this other actual outcome. And this process is extremely potent way of manipulating people toward they act in a way that is striving to fulfill this expectation. but they don't ever get the expectation. So the person doing this manipulation wins potentially. It depends on what you mean by win, in a very unethical type of win. But then the price paid is the person gets this feeling of having been drained and manipulated and so forth. This is, it's actually precisely to describe this sort of process that I introduced the probability dimension. And I wrote a book about this called Accidental Vampires and the Real Wooden Stake, if you have any interest. Another class of practices that are nicely modeled in this simple cartoon or this tension release surprise manipulation. This is actually really useful in therapeutic contexts, such as sound therapy. You create an expectation. You're doing exactly the same thing as the previous slide. You're creating an expectation and then you're blocking it, creating an expectation and then blocking it. And then finally, you give them the outcome. And so you're building this sort of psychological tension as this attention is gathered toward this expectation and it's pulled outward, but then blocked. And then you finally give it to them. And there's a release of internal tension and anxiety that can be incredibly powerful. And there's many different sorts of circumstances that utilize this very skillfully. This is essentially a core feature of good musical composition. So, for example, if you listen to the compositions of Bach, he's doing this all the time on many nested levels. In fact, this process essentially is very central to music theory. Sound therapy is something to which much of my professional life has been devoted, can be framed. Most people frame sound therapy, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but if you do encounter it, please disregard practically anything you ever hear about it, because it's this swarm of bogus pseudoscience and so forth. But sound therapy practices can be, and often are, incredibly successful for guiding people into comfortable, relaxed states that are supportive for their health and well-being. And sound therapy, instead of framing it in terms of using magical frequencies or some such thing, instead it can be really nicely framed in terms of using surprise, expectancy, alternation, and tension and release that results therefrom. Essentially, you use a sound to grab someone's attention. Like you play an unusual sound and it attracts their attention. Now you have their attention. And now you use that attention that you have a hold of to guide them into a lower surprise domain of harmony, beauty, drone, and repetition. But then their attention is going to wander at some point, and so you grab it again, and then you guide it into this low surprise domain. So you use surprise to grab attention, and then you use low surprise to drive it into states of harmony and beauty and relaxation. And you repeat this until the person's attention stabilizes in the low surprise domain. And then guess what? At the end of it, they report therapeutic results of all sorts. And this sound therapy also involves greasing the dimensions. For example, guiding someone's attention through their body. You can point an instrument that vibrates their body tangibly and then sweep it up and down their body. Or you can do that with a device like sound beds that I build and so forth. You can also guide their attention through the space around them, and of course guide their attention through the frequency dimensions and so forth. And all these affective dimensions to which those spaces and dimensions are coupled are illuminated by their attention. And so you're also simultaneously guiding them through private spaces to which you don't have access. So in honor of Dr. Martinez, who I'm grateful showed up today, this is just a toy idea, essentially, that you could create a topological classification of illusions using attention field theory. I'm not going to go into these here because I'm not expert enough to do so, but I think that attention field theory, when I read his awesome book, The Illusionist Brain, I quickly recognized that there's a lot of overlap and that potentially attention field theory might provide a useful framework for classifying illusions and so forth. So very quickly before to lead into the closing, back to the roots of attention field theory, which was initially to model this so-called life energy that is classically in Chinese called qi. Some key phenomenological features of qi: it arises from sufficient attention intensity. When attention reaches a certain threshold, so you gather your attention in your hand, for example, when it reaches a certain threshold, a new type of feeling arises that's unusual. And this takes practice to do, but with practice, it's very reliable. There's also a sense of field-like flow, as if you can move this flowing field through your body, but that flowing field seems to be simply attention in some sense. There's also increased dimensional resolution. When attention is adequately gathered into a region of the body, ever finer sensory details grow apparent. There's also increased dimensional coupling, such that when one gathers attention adequately in one hand, they can feel the movement of their other hand. So the movement of one hand the interdependence of the two becomes greater, apparently, until in a state of deeply practiced Qigong, it feels as if every movement of the body is actually one movement that that each part of the body is just a feature of. And in the great Tai Chi classics, that's described very clearly. And there's also a sense of effortlessness, such that it feels as if one is being breathed and being moved. So I propose reframing qi through the lens of attention field theory and free energy principle. The classic statement, where attention goes, qi flows, I might instead, I didn't write this down, reframe it as where attention goes, organism states change. It's much less catchy, but it actually seems to fit the facts quite well. According to traditional framing of Qigong practices, harmonious, unobstructed qi flow lead to health and well-being. Could it be the case that harmonious and unobstructed attention flow lead to health and well-being? I propose just that. A revised framing for this so-called life energy is that on the attention field theory side, attention is like a field guided through M space being our model of the world. And on the FEP side, that precision weighting on internal states reduces free energy as affected by precisely that attention flow. So a provisional redefinition of qi being on the subjective side, it's the attention field. And on the objective side, it's negative or reverse free energy, essentially the unfree energy. And I would love to get some feedback about if that actually makes sense from the free energy principle perspective. And I wanted to note one thing that's an important clue that I'm really hoping that some of you neuroscience experts can help illuminate. One thing that in all of my investigations that I noticed that it seems to be really important for understanding these things is that when you place your hand in front of a strongly vibrating woofer or speaker that's playing a simple sine tone, especially, the feeling that you get in your hand is almost precisely the same as the feeling you get in your hand after you have become proficient at Qigong. So when you practice Qigong and you gather qi in your hands, it feels just like putting your hands in front of a speaker. And so this led me to propose that, so I considered what is happening in the nervous system, in the nerves in your hand when they're being stimulated by the sound. One thing I know from physics is that they are being stimulated more or less coherently. And then I discovered that, and you all probably know this, that when attention is gathered in a region of the body, there's also an increase in coherence in the some correlated regions of the brain. And so my hypothesis is that the feeling of qi is correlated with nervous system coherence. And I would love to learn more about whether that fits the facts as you know them or not. In leading to closing, some notable FEP, AFT, attention field theory, free energy principle correspondences provisionally proposed by this humbled non-FEP expert, that the A field, the attention field correlates at least in part, with precision weighting distribution across the generative model, particularly those whatever aspects or layers of the generative model are conscious. That M space correlating with the conscious domain of the generative model, meta attention and will corresponding with policy selection, radial flows in the P dimension corresponding with Bayesian inference. An interesting thing I hope we can discuss is the relationship between the P=1 surface, where actions and observations take place in FEP, and the Markov blanket. Could the P=1 surface be reasonably construed to be the Markov blanket of the domain of conscious awareness? Does that make any sense? Of course, the domain of conscious awareness isn't itself a physical thing. It's sort of a game space in a sense. So I'm really curious about whether that makes sense or not, but there's a very obvious apparent analog, and I wonder if that analog is legitimate or just intuitive. And that homeostatic and effective axes correspond to deep homeostatic priors. Some summary and key takeaways, attention field theory. I think that I don't need to go through these because you all just listened to it, and you'll have this document. And just some open questions. Does attention field theory precisely mirror FEP, active inference dynamics? If not, what revisions are needed? Could FEP constructs be more explicitly integrated into this framework? Can FEP formalize A field dynamics in M space? Second question, where do timeless concepts, some of you might have already thought of this, math, logic, Platonic forms, and so forth, where do they fit into this framework? Does AFT apply to non-conscious attention dynamics? It seems that as much as it mirrors FEP dynamics, then it would be the case. But that's to be discovered. And what new therapies and practices might best leverage FEP dynamics via attention field direction? Of course, the key coherence hypothesis I proposed is increased neural coherence in the correlated brain regions correlated with attended body regions. Is that also mirrored in the coherence of the peripheral nerves? What are the best ways to empirically investigate that, or is that already known? And then further exploration of illusions. Can the taxonomy of illusions be in AFT? Could that be leveraged to refine or test attention flow theories experimentally? And in closing, I want to thank you. Pun intended. I don't know. It's not even a pun. Thank you for your time and attention. Truly, it's genuinely an honor and a delight. And I'm humbled to be presenting to this audience, and truly grateful for your joining me here today. Thank you very much. And again, I want to point out that everything I presented is a synthesis of things I've learned from people much smarter than I, including you, Professor Friston, and Mark Soames and Chris Fields, and thank you all so very much. It's an honor and a delight. Oh, and by the way, in the PDF, there's lots of references, and they're divided into categories, and the relevance to the presentation is there too. And the chair will presumably let me know how to best share that PDF with you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Thomas, for an extensive and thorough and deeply interesting presentation. Now
I hope it wasn't too long.
well, there was a lot to say, I think, so this is hard to avoid. But now the custom is to just briefly unmute our microphones and give Thomas a round of applause. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you for having me.
I will now moderate. We have a little bit of time for group discussion and comments, and I see already that Ian has their hand raised.
I just wanted to say that you had a really wonderful presentation, and I also wanted to also admit that I'm a practitioner of meditation. I love meditation, especially Vipassana and mindfulness-based stress reduction. And what I found to be very interesting when it comes to your espousal of attention field theory, I see that it has a lot of parallels with Francisco Varela's ideas on neurophenomenology. And what neurophenomenology is that it aims to combine descriptors of first-person experience with neural dynamic correlates in a way that informs the disciplines of neuroscience and phenomenology quite elegantly. But what one of the limitations of this method is that it doesn't provide a very rigorous mathematical formalism that the free energy principle provides. My question is have you, my observation is that this framework is very similar to Varela's framework and it also has a lot of parallels because of its emphasis on contemplative practices. Varela was a very excellent practitioner of Tibetan Buddhist meditation, and he was one of the founders of the Life and Mind Institute, which is now in Charlottesville, alongside the Dalai Lama. So I'm just wondering, do you think that your framework can also inform and potentially bridge, the very reductionist, very intellectually rigorous fields of neuroscience with more first-person phenomenological descriptors of lived experience?
Well, from my naive perspective, it seems to me to be the case, but it seems to me to largely depend on how clearly it mirrors the free energy principle and active inference underpinnings. And it seems to me, and this is part of why I'm here, is to find out if this actually is the case or can be the case, that this framework can be revised, improved, or added some nuances, or even shifted some way that it could potentially very clearly and precisely mirror free energy principle, active inference underpinnings. And just so much as it does so, it seems to me that it would do what you're proposing, and if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I also wanted to say, when you kept talking about Qigong, it reminded me, especially the attentional flows, it reminded me a lot of body scan meditations.
Which is really the same.
It is. And I just wanted to say again, even though this is my first time speaking here, I found this presentation to be insightful. And I think it also corresponds a lot with the predictive coding aspect of active inference and the free energy principle, especially that framework in which you when it comes to the repetitive sounds and people's expectation, slowly goes closer and closer to the bound of that p equals 1. That habituation could perhaps be from my understanding, even though I'm not a very big expert, PhD level expert on active inference, it can be a very intuitive and conceptually refined way of approaching the complex mathematical formalisms of predictive error, predictive coding, active inference. It would be a good model to explain that. But of course, I'm not a I'm not too refined on my understanding of that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I see Maria Luisa has her hand raised.
Okay, thank you, Peter Thomas, for your presentation. Coming from a psychological and philosophical background, I have some rather simple questions for you. Oh, yeah, I also work with attention and active inference in philosophy of cognitive sciences. I'm a PhD student. Anyway, my question is, what's the difference between attention and consciousness in your theory? Because what you described as subjective attention could be easily described as consciousness. And so would you defer them somehow, or would you say that they are the same thing, or consciousness does not belong to your theory at all? And I was curious about the neurobiology part of your theory, because you said that you wanted to bring subjective and neurobiological stuff of attention into your theory, but then you just jumped to physics. And so will you use the current neuroscience of attention, or are you going to propose something novel? And the neuroscience of attention, would it be just visual, or it would include all the senses? I think that's it.
To your second question, when I said neurobiology slash FEP slash active inference, I think that's what it was. I was really referring to my presumption that the neurobiology is well described by active inference and free energy principle, although that might be you might call it the computational neurobiology, but basically that's what I meant by neurobiology. So I'm not even a beginner level in my knowledge of those things, but I have been studying the free energy principle and active inference as devotedly as I can manage for the last since I first encountered it a couple of years ago, in order to try to determine from my perspective if it actually does mirror attention field theory as clearly as it appears to me to do. So that's I am assuming that the free energy principle and active inference captures the neurobiology to which I'm referring as that which crosses over the phenomenology in the center as attention field theory. If that answers your second question adequately. And the first one, I used the word conscious a few times in the presentation, because it seems clear to me that the domain that I'm calling M space refers to that domain of attention dynamics that are conscious. Active inference describes, of course, attention dynamics that are on every level, that presumably most of which is not conscious, but attention being framed as precision weighting. So the domain of that attention field theory describes is the domain that we would say is the conscious domain. And one of my questions is, does it also describe, is it, as much as it fits the conscious domain, however much that is, does it also fit equally well with the unconscious domains? And if that's the case, what's the difference? What distinguishes the two? And maybe that's a big question. But the word consciousness itself is a word I intentionally avoid as much as is feasible, because it is so ill-defined, and it has a lot of baggage in a lot of different ways. One of the primary pieces of that baggage being that people conceive it to be something along the lines of some kind of stuff, some like magical material, or some other sort of or like a thing, like my consciousness is some sort of entity, like a spirit or something. And this is kind of sidestepping that issue by simply describing attention dynamics, because if you think about it, every aspect of yourself that you call conscious is precisely the distribution of your awareness. Wherever you're not aware, you're no longer conscious. And as soon as your awareness or your attention ceases, you cease to be conscious. And then as soon as so attention described as a field within our model space gives a kind of a comfortable way to sidestep the concerns about what exactly does consciousness even mean. So hopefully that addresses your first question somewhat by sidestepping it.
Yeah, sort of. I also wrote a similar comment of Ian's that you should read Umberto Maturana's Biology of Cognition, that he talks a lot about domains and that thing that you said, communication, dimensional coupling. It's all there already somehow, so it would
Great.
be
Thank you.
a nice reading for you.
I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate that, because like I mentioned before, I developed all of this independently from the academic world, not knowing about any of these things, but just as a way to try to understand things that I wanted to understand. And then now I'm stepping into this world to see how it seems to fit with a lot of things, but hopefully I want to have it corrected and improved by interacting with people such as you. So thank you very much. So yeah, I will definitely be digging into that as soon as possible.
Thank you, Maria Luisa. I'll just briefly add my voice to say that it was a nice presentation, but also covering a lot of ground, which makes it hard for me to try to kind of answer all of the questions or go into all of the different points you brought up, because there were many points, and I think mostly I want to say that I do think on most of them an active inference or free energy principle perspective would be feasible and would be something like you imagine. That's my general sense. So when you're talking about the circles, the p-space, now p-value, sorry, I forgot the term, but I know visually the movements out, and so that's very clearly very close to a Bayesian inference, and I think it could indeed be implemented in this way, and a few other components like this as well, which, I mean, Carl might have some thoughts, but otherwise, probably many of these little points, for example, you gave a brief suggestion for how one might think of Qigong or Qigong in this perspective. Many of these little one-slide points probably could contain a whole presentation on their own, in honesty, which would be interesting and worth discussing. But so mostly I just wanted to say that I think on average, you are correct that that there are enough similarities or even places where an active inference account would exactly be a description of what you're saying. That a presentation here makes a lot of sense. I'm a modeler myself, so kind of my impulse is always to want to model some of it, and of course then you would have to pick something very concrete and just one situation and spend the time with the code, and that's a different beast entirely also. But also just wanted to say that at least from the perspective of me and people in, I think many people in this community, that would be kind of a natural next step to concretize what is meant with many of these ideas, and also to see where they fit and where they do not. But that might be for the future. Yes, I just wanted to mention briefly. And finally, also, it's nice to see. So I studied some Chinese philosophy, and I've done some Korean Qigong related things myself, and it's interesting to see these be brought into the same space. I reviewed a paper recently on Qi practices from an active inference cognitive science perspective. So there must be other people in this space out there. Yes. So mostly I wanted to bring some enthusiasm to the table, but not spend too much time. I think we have time for one more brief question. And I see there's a hand raised, but you might respond first if you want.
I just want to thank you for that. And yes, indeed, there was way too much squeezed into this presentation. But however, because it's a new, unfamiliar framework, I really wanted to give people kind of a big picture, even if they were missing a lot, to kind of see it. Because if you just take part of it, since it's a different way of looking at some things, I feel like just not introducing it kind of takes that. And I was hoping, to meet people and get feedback that would help me figure out how to best proceed with this in a way that would be useful. So I really, really appreciate your feedback.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm sure Carl will have more concrete thoughts, because I also don't want to take too much of the time from him and the other questions in the group. But in any case, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have a last question or comment with the hand raised. I see ready as the last bit of the name, but being unfamiliar with you, I don't want to attempt to pronounce your name.
It's fine, sir. Actually. First of all, Mr. Anderson, I would like to thank you for this presentation, as it was very much informative. I am a class 10 student from India, and I do research on quantum mechanics and unification of forces. So, after getting interested in biology, I thought I would attend this session. And listening to you speak, your thoughts flashed mine, and I thought maybe that we can represent attention field in a form of classical mechanics and quantum mechanics. Like attention field can be an inverse square field, like in a sense that there will be a constant and variable that determines the attention would be how much conscious the person is, and some other terms included in that. The constant varies according to the action performed by the other person. For example, if I am walking, it doesn't produce that much of attention, and therefore we could say its value as 1. But if, for example, I have a gun and I'm shooting a person, it's the constant value would be 2, attracting more attention. In that, is it possible to represent attention field in that form, sir?
That's a good question. It seems like what you're saying fits, and also fits well with active inference, if I'm understanding you correctly. For a less probable event generally attracts more attention, so it's more salient. So when a firecracker goes off, that unexpected event yields a lot of it. There's a lot of attention goes there naturally. It's highly salient, whereas habitual practice, like drinking your cup of tea, you're driving down the road, you can do it without even thinking, and your attention doesn't have to be involved so much. So if I'm following you, it sounds like what you're saying was very much in line with what I presented, and also with active inference paradigm.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it, and nice to meet you virtually.
Yes. So, can I have your email, sir, for future contact?
Yes, maybe Peter, when you share the PDF, do you have everyone's email who attended, such that they can all be emailed something?
No, but I have an emailing list that everyone here has probably seen, so I can. I'll find a way to disseminate.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
Sir, question to the host, sir. Sorry. Do you know when the recording will be uploaded?
When? I hope to upload it tomorrow, or during this week at least.
Yes. Sir, to the neurobiology Gmail account, I would have sent an email yesterday, sir. From there, you can get my email address, sir.
Yeah, probably. I will also check this. So I'm manning the email. So if you didn't, if I don't respond, you can just write me again. But I plan to respond to these emails tomorrow as well. That should be
Yes,
fine.
sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Of course. All right. So I think without much further ado, I think it's time to hand over the flame of. No, I don't know what to say. Hand over the rest of the time to Carl. Yeah, sorry, I lost the metaphor there, Carl, for a moment.
You were, the Olympic torch, is that what you were trying to? Yeah, I see.
Something like that. No, but it's
An
your turn.
Olympiad of attention fields. Excellent, thank you very much. So it's my turn now, is it?
Indeed.
Right. Well, Thomas, thank you very much. That was an overwhelming and inspiring presentation, and you can tell by the conversation that it's ignited a lot of interest. Yeah, unfortunately, sort of Mark and Chris dropped off a few minutes ago, I presume because they have other meetings, which is a shame because I would have liked to have heard their perspective. But it may be the case that they will be listening to this recording. So I'll just press ahead anyway in terms of providing the kind of feedback that you were asking for. Before I do that, just to contextualize that feedback, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to proceed from this point on?
That's a very good question, and the what that might look like, I suppose, depends on the feedback I get from you and Chris and Mark and the like, because this is something that I have applied to very usefully to frame these practices that are generally framed in some mystical way, framing them in a way that's just as useful, but in a way that seems to be actually coherent with good science. So it's very useful, this framing, and in practical settings such as that. But then when I encountered the free energy principle and active inference, and also started studying some more things about more modern neuroscience, just including, general Bayesian brain and so forth, and then also some of Mike Levin's work and others, I started recognizing that it appears to me that this framing actually isn't just a useful heuristic for working with attention in day-to-day life or in therapeutic practices, but is potentially a way that these fundamental processes can be mirrored in terms of our subjective experience. So where it goes from there, I suppose, depends on how much it does or can be in genuine accord with the free energy principle and active inference dynamics and neurophysiological processes that are underneath. Because if it can be made or already does to fit those things well, then it actually has potentially value for all kinds of fields of which I'm not even familiar, that depend on the domains of psychology, for example. Or another example that's very clear to me is there's these traditions from around the world that or the most prominent ones being from China, like acupuncture and acupressure, and also yogic practices and qigong and the like, that there's countless rigorous studies showing that they yield these real therapeutic benefits, but they are framed traditionally in terms of this magical so-called energy flowing through you. And so we have these very definite, well demonstrated results, and this very sort of traditional frameworks that are very strongly tied to various kinds of cultural artifacts that don't fit with modern science well. And if we had a framing of those practices that have those results that also fit the facts of modern science, then we could have countless therapeutic applications that don't yet exist. And one more thing to try to answer your question is something I find potentially incredibly valuable about it is that it offers a way to co-model simultaneously lots of diverse sorts of practices that are otherwise modeled kind of in their own little world. You know, some of those psychological practices where you move back and forth across, you know, two sort of framings, or these practices where you move your attention through your body back and forth, or all kinds of different practices can simultaneously be co-modeled in one system that, if it can mirror coherently the free energy active inference underpinnings, then it's would be essentially modeling those practices within that active inference framework, but in this sort of more user interface level that isn't the mathematics, but it's more the day-to-day practice when you're actually doing it. When you're doing the practices, you're not actually doing the mathematics, but having that rigorous underpinning. I think hopefully I answered your question somewhat.
Yeah, yes, you did. So to summarize that, then, it's a question of finding a framing that allows you to join the dots between Eastern approaches to well-being and practices and a sort of Western scientific framing. Is that?
At least in part, but not all of these things that can be modeled in this framework so naturally have anything to do with Eastern practices. So, you know, illusions and tricks and the practice of the carrot on the stick manipulation that I described, and communication, verbal communication. There's a lot more things that are naturally accommodated in this than just those practices. Those practices are just the root of how I was led to this. In trying to model those practices, that led me to develop it, but then it appears to have much broader application the more clearly it aligns with active inference, especially.
Right. Yes. No, I appreciate that. I didn't want to be too restrictive when we talk about Eastern practices, perhaps more generally then. Narrative accounts that live in their own field with their own rhetoric, that have a magical aspect. You want to demystify them and provide some kind of construct validity to these practices, and possibly discover new practices by, I repeat, joining the dots or casting or reframing in an integrative way these ideas in relation to a formal account. And by formal, I mean a computational or essentially a physics-based account, which you will be quite apt to promulgate, given your background with the holographic principle and the like. Would that be a more balanced summary?
I think listening to you say that, I realized a much more accurate and generally correct response is that modeling any practice that is based on the guidance, the intentional guidance of attention through your model. So would any kind of practice that involves guiding attention intentionally to achieve some result. So that's the very broad range, and that's the thing that I find so valuable about this, because it, or potentially useful, is that it gives a nice way of usefully framing any practice that involves moving attention through the various domains of our experience intentionally guiding attention here or there or in some pathway or towards some location. So I think that much better summarizes my my view of its utility.
And in communicating this, practically, what would you do? Would you write papers, or would you write a book or a monograph or a blog? Or what would be the medium by which you would communicate, use, broadcast?
Well, I have written a couple books about it already and published a couple books about it, but those were written prior to my familiarity with your work and those of many of your collaborators. That so it was sort of a kind of a standalone kind of useful heuristic for understanding practices that involve attentional guidance. But now I recognize its coherence or potential coherence with these the blossoming scientific principles. And so my intention to reach out to you and to Chris Fields and Mark Soames and Mike Levin and so forth was essentially to get feedback so that I can develop it further in such a way that it grows its coherence with these frameworks, because it's so useful for the day-to-day user. And so basically, prior to writing any academic papers about it, I wanted to get this kind of feedback. And yes, certainly my intention is to write academic papers, and those will probably have to be written, at least in some cases, in collaboration with people that are far more expert than I in the parts that I'm less in which I'm less expert, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people out there who I think would consider themselves working in that space of skilling people in terms of the way they deploy their attention, either in a therapeutic context or sort of well-being context, meditation, or psychophysically. So I smiled at the sort of the collaboration part of it, because it may well be that you have to become the expert in order to write things, which is why I was asking, do you want to write scientific articles or books? It does strike me that this kind of approach is probably more suitable for communicating as a book, in the sense that every issue you touched upon already has an enormous literature behind it, and it would take, for each of those issues, you'd probably want to do a PhD, which would take 3 years to do that, and you'll go down all sorts of rabbit holes. Whereas if you just stay above the fray and try to synthesize in the way that you did today, and you clearly aspire to, by being as inclusive as you can, I think it's going to be a more natural, an easier way forward for you would be to actually spend some months reading around the subject, getting the kind of feedback, and doing exactly what you do now, which is getting feedback specifically from this particular group, to create a library of things that you want to mention or nod to when you do your ultimate synthesis, in the light of what you have unearthed in terms of reading about, say, the free energy principle, or Chris Fields' work, or Mike Levin's work. I say that because what I normally do, and what I have done, is just pick out a number of authors and papers and opportunities that I think would be useful for you in terms of finding sympathetic and good fits to the arguments that you have expounded, that will be found in the more technical literature, or the psychology literature, or the ethology literature. And my hope is that those will be useful for you. But I repeat, I think they're going to be more useful in terms of writing the next book. I did notice you've written books before, so you're clearly not shy of committing to writing a book, and I suspect that's going to be the best vehicle forward. That said, well, I'm going to, if you'll allow me, share the screen and just take you through a series of papers that speak to some of the key issues that you and some key simple questions that you asked during the presentation. As Peter said, you covered so much material. I ran out of space on my screen about 3/4 of the way through, so I've only, it's going to be a somewhat selective feedback based upon what I was able to sort of forage during the presentation.
Professor Friston, may I ask permission to step away for 30 seconds? Just
yes, of course. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I will be right back.
Okay. That was quick.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Let me go from sharing this screen if I can. Very good. Okay, I'm going to speak quickly. This is going to be a stream of consciousness, largely for the recording as opposed to engaging in the discussion. So this is really a summary of the thoughts that your presentation induced. It's, I repeat, selective and not terribly well themed, so I may have to jump around a bit, but hopefully it'll speak to some of the questions you asked. Just before we start, you asked, is there any biological or neurophysiological evidence for the connection between attention and the coherence in the sense of dynamical systems theory between neuronal dynamics? Yes, absolutely. So probably one of the best examples of that is a hypothesis by Pascal Fries, who's a German neuroscientist, and he's entitled that Communication Through Coherence. But the communication here is communication between neuronal populations. And the story here is that there is a very tight relationship between the degree of synchronization or coherence in terms of the neuronal dynamics and how that might mediate attentional selection of various sorts. So it's a neurophysiological account of attention, which I think you could certainly cite as evidence that there is empirical grounding for this notion linking synchronization of various sorts to attentional mechanisms. I just thought I'd put that up as one way of yeah. So this is the redundant rhythms for cognition, communication through coherence, and you can access this. I think it will be freely accessible through the National Library of Medicine. So that's that one. But what I wanted to do was just start by one opportunity for you might be at some point to engage with the Minimal Phenomenal Experience project. Have you heard about this, the MPE project? I think you'd like this because it's spearheaded by a gentleman called Thomas Metzinger, who's one of the one of the good and great in philosophy of mind and consciousness in Germany. And in recent years, he's become this is Thomas Metzinger here. He's become fascinated with the essence of consciousness in its most minimal sense. So I won't go into it, but he's written a 500-page book about this minimal phenomenal experience. Crucially, he and some colleagues, including Helen, I don't know how to pronounce that word, Slakter, have introduced an annual prize for an essay or an article that provides either computation or neuroscience accounts of minimal phenomenal experience. And it strikes me that even if you don't win it, the act of submitting it, and having it reviewed by peers in this particular space, a mixture of neuroscience and philosophy, would be a growing experience for you, and certainly an interesting challenge. And you might even win, which would be very nice. Give you a bit of exposure. So it's not been announced, but this year the prize will be for an account of a minimal phenomenal experience, which is just basically awareness of your own attention and nothing else. So there's no content there. Which sort of something the latter part of your presentation did remind me of this not oceanic state, but the kinds of states that many meditators aspire to, of a content-less and possibly non-dual aspect. And that prize will be announced, I imagine, in the next. Has been announced. Oh, there you are. So they have it. Very good. So that might be a nice opportunity. I'm just foregrounding here the work of Chris Fields. I'm aware that Chris has gone, but just for the remainder of the audience and people watching this recording, I was engaged by your notion, by your previous work with the holographic principle. And of course, that's what Chris Fields has brought to the table in terms of applying quantum information theory, or using quantum information theory to provide a quantum theoretic formulation of the free energy principle that rests exactly on the holographic principle, wherein the holographic screen plays the role, or the Markov blanket, or the thing that separates self from non-self, or thing from something else. I highlight this particular paper in this because it draws a connection to a formal or a practical implementation in terms of topological quantum neural networks, which is unpacked in greater detail in these two companion papers that end up again focusing on quantum topological neural networks and the associated tensor networks. I'm focusing on that as one avenue for you to be able to join the dots between your formulation and more formal formulations, either in quantum information theory or the classical information theory of the free energy principle, or the quantum and the classical formulations of the free energy principle. And in brief, and this is, I'm hoping, going to be practical help for you, I would counsel you associate your M space with an information geometry, or the space that emerges, a metric space that emerges from information geometries. And I'll drill down on that in a moment, because I think that is the right calculus and the right maths that accommodates all that you were describing. So the M space now becomes a manifold. And that manifold has a very particular meaning in relating AFT to the free energy principle. So I repeat, the M space is a manifold. It's a statistical manifold, and it's a special manifold that where we're defining a statistical manifold as a surface, if you like, on a space where every point on that space corresponds to a probability distribution or a belief. So this is what a statistical manifold means. It means that we're dealing with a special space in which every point is equipped with a probability distribution. That is a special kind of space because it is a metric space, because there is a well-defined metric on that space called the Fisher information metric. Furthermore, it's special for your arguments because the free energy principle, at its simplest, is just a statement that that statistical manifold must exist if you can separate self from non-self or a thing from something else. So the whole point of the free energy principle is that you can interpret the internal dynamics, say neuronal activity, on the inside of the self or the thing, in a way that means that those internal dynamics stand in for or encode or represent a belief, a probability distribution over the external things, about something else, about this exactly what you meant by the state of affairs out there. So if you just, and you could probably throw away the rest of the free energy principle with just that notion that you're now allowed to talk about the internal dynamics of somebody's brain or something or a self as being equipped with a statistical manifold that has a well-defined metric. That metric, I repeat, is a Fisher information metric that provides now this space with a geometry that define the space in which the manifold lives with an information geometry. That's really useful for you because when you move around in this space or on this statistical manifold, you are literally doing belief updating. And the forces that you were referring to when you're talking about your hypersphere and moving to the periphery in response to, say, some sensory evidence, was just a statement of the forces that ensue by moving around on that statistical manifold. And the formal link with the free energy principle is that this manifold can be regarded as a Waddington landscape, where the potential, which you also mentioned as another sort of mathematical object you can envisage, just is the variation of free energy. So you've got now an M space where any point in that M space is associated with a probability distribution. A free energy functional of that probability distribution provides you now with an objective function, a Lagrangian, a potential. That potential can be read in many ways as a Lagrangian in classical physics. It is the surprise you were talking about in information theory. That's a self-information that is upper bounded by the variation of free energy. And if we ignore the bound aspect, then it is just the negative log probability of some sensory data given this particular belief structure. So what that means is you now have a landscape that is effectively a free energy landscape whose gradients apply the forces. And those forces now drive the belief updating in exactly the spirit you were describing when you were talking about your hypersphere and you were moving representations or beliefs towards the periphery in a forceful way and implicitly a mindful way, because we're talking about beliefs, we're not talking about thermodynamics, we're talking about movements in this information geometry. So I thought that was a nice way of finding the right kind of mathematics that makes perfect sense of your M spaces and the movement within your hypersphere in terms of the physics of belief updating and self-organization that you could actually also chase all the way back to Varela and Manturana should you want to. Within that, your A space, I think, would be more specific, and certainly in formulations of the generative model, and I emphasize model because you could also associate your M space is going to be defined as a space that has a metric, which is the Fisher information metric, which is also, we'll come to later, the precision. You could also associate, well, that free energy functional, that potential self-informational surprise is a functional of a model. So you could also say that your M space depends upon a model, and that is the generative model or the world model or the internal model. That means that you can associate any particular position in your M space with a particular belief under that model. So mathematically, that also makes a lot of sense, in the sense that the free energy functional of your belief at this point in your M space is conditioned upon a particular model. Now, the generative models come in many flavors, but most generally and technically, the generative model is just the probability of cause and consequence, the states of affairs and the sensory consequences of those states of affairs, as experienced by an observer of those states of affairs. That's generically divided into a prior and a likelihood. And in discrete state space models, in the active inference sphere, the likelihood part is called an A mapping, and the priors and the transitions and the dynamics are assigned to a B mapping or a B tensor. So now we've got a really nice home for your A space, which is effectively the part of the generative model that corresponds to the likelihood mapping. And that likelihood mapping in discrete state space models is always written in terms of an A tensor or a likelihood tensor, which is why I'm emphasizing the link to tensor networks. How does that relate to attention? It's very simple. So the A tensor basically maps from states of affairs, sometimes called latent states or hidden states, because they're hidden behind that which is observable, your eyes or your sensory epithelia, and the observations, the sensory observations that would ensue given that state of affairs. And you just write that down as a big matrix, so that you've got for every state here, there's some from your point of view, there's some outcome here. So you can just write this down as a large matrix that just maps from cause to consequence, or states of affairs to observable outcomes. But crucially, you can contextualize that by adding different slices of this A matrix to create a 3 tensor. And those different slices, because they are all unique likelihood mappings, are equipped with different precisions. And that now affords you the opportunity, if you read attention as picking out the right likelihood mapping in this context-sensitive way that has the right precision, then you've now, I think, got a way of, in principle, simulating a very elemental kind of attention, which is picking out the right slice from an A space, if you read the A space as a likelihood tensor. And that has lots of different names in machine learning. Slot attention would be one of these. So I think there's a lot of mileage, should you want to pursue that mileage, in linking the notion of an A space to a likelihood tensor, an A tensor, as it is used in artificial intelligence research, active inference, and indeed in machine learning. I think there's lots of nice links there. That does rest upon that argument that your attention is really optimizing or picking the slice of the likelihood mapping, or optimizing in a predictive coding sense the precision of that mapping. That has a nice connection with early formulations. Where is this one now? Yeah, that has a nice connection with early formulations. Just forgive me for a second. Let's try and find it. Here we go. Oh no, my apologies. Oh dear. Ah, it's behind. It's hiding underneath that thing there. There it is. Ah. Well, okay. You mentioned the Posner paradigm. So the notion of attention, read as a high order aspect of free energy minimization, really picking out the right fields or the right modalities or the right sensory streams actually arose in not a discrete state space model, but a continuous state space model, which, when you apply the free energy principle active inference to, you get predictive coding. So the original simulations, which I'll show you later when I can reveal the appropriate paper, were by Harriet Feldman, and they actually used the Posner paradigm. They simulated the Posner paradigm in order to show how it worked practically and what the neurophysiological underpinnings were. So that would be a very early place to start if you wanted to talk about how is attention in its simplest form modeled and understood in terms of Bayesian mechanics in the context of active inference under continuous state space models. And I repeat, it starts with the Posner paradigm. How on earth would you actually model that? How would you create a synthetic agent that could show the same kinds of attentional responses to the Posner paradigm? And the key thing that this rests upon is setting the precision of the likelihood mapping, which brings us back to the A space, which brings us back to the A tensors, which brings us back to Chris Field's work. So we'll come to that in a moment. Hopefully, what we do? Oh, so I put this paper up just to sort of change gears for a second until we get back to that precision account. I put a series of papers up which I thought would be interesting for you, more as sort of background reading. People in ethology and philosophy, and indeed actually in psychiatry, talking about fields, not so much of attention, but of affordances. But if you read attention in a slightly different way from optimizing the precision of your likelihood mapping in a context-sensitive fashion, then you can start now to talk about the epistemic affordances, which I think you were intimating by using the word salient. This is salient for me because it resolves my uncertainty and has meaning for me, and it dictates the kind of things that I would look towards or sample selectively because they are salient in terms of the agency and the authoring of my policies and plans and actions in this context-sensitive way. So that those kinds of arguments have been expanded into the field of cultural niche construction and the notion of field of affordances of this epistemic sort. You talked about sort of symbols. I thought you were going to talk about semiotics at some point, which you might want to do. And the writing of people such as Julian Kimmerstein and Mark Miller and Eric Reitfeld might be very pertinent to that kind of discussion. Again, it's more narrative accounts. They don't do any simulations, but they are very well informed from the point of view of the philosophy of mind, but also with a particular focus on co-constructed environments, niche construction, deontic cues, the affordances that we build around us for ourselves collectively, which spoke in part to your treatment of the something only being existing in a sort of collective sense, if it's a shared narrative or some kind of common ground that's out there, and they discuss that, I think, very nicely. So this is one example of a number of papers that they've read, but I'm just introducing this as a synthese paper, Feeling a Grip by Julian Kimmerstein. But you might want to look at the references here and subsequent writings by Julian. I mentioned there two different kinds of attention. So if you wanted to just be very precise, open brackets, close brackets, in terms of distinguishing between attention and salience, you will come across a formal difference between the two uses of the word attention in the active inference literature. attention of the kind that I was just discussing in terms of greasing the pathways, exactly in the sense that you were intimating, whereby you're assigning a high precision to some kind of sensory evidence through the likelihood mapping in a context-sensitive fashion that could be driven by, as in the Posner paradigm, some endogenous attention, top-down attention, or it could be, as you described, with an explosion grabbing your attention in an exogenous fashion. The common mechanism there is basically focusing in exactly the sort of the searchlight kind of analogy, by assigning high precision to this part of the visual field, or this part of my body, or this part of some representational space, and attenuating the precision elsewhere. So assigning a high confidence to these channels, or this part of the field of the sensorium that I could be sampling, and attenuating it elsewhere. So that would be the sort of the attention in its most elemental and fundamental form. And then the question is, how do you deploy your attention, i.e. how do you deploy the precision and nuance and contextualize, pick out the right tenses in a discrete setting that set up the right paths from the sensory information through to your representations of states of affairs through belief updating with this kind of attention. That's very distinct from salience as it's used in active inference. Salience is an attribute of the way that I will act. So I could, be a sessile organism that just has sensory organs, and I could spend my life attending to this and attending to that without ever actually moving. So I could be a surveillance camera at an airport, for example. I can't move my camera, but what I can do is just pick out the quadrants of the RGB feed, or my visual input, my camera input, that I think are going to be most provide the most precise information. Basically, which parts of the the sensory input or the visual input is illuminated, for example. Or I could adjust it depending upon whether it's day or night. I could adjust the precision appropriately. That would be attention per se. Or I could actually move my camera. If I can move my camera, if I can act back up on the world, if I can close the action perception cycle, then I'm going to want to know what moves do I make in order to get the most precise information, the most unambiguous information that will resolve my uncertainty about states of affairs. That's computable in terms of the expected information gain, which I repeat can be cast in terms of another kind of precision. But crucially, that kind of salience, or responding to salient cues by acting, is conditioned upon acting. So if you read the literature that distinguishes between attention and salience, that's what's implied here, that there are certain kinds of attentionally driven behaviors that would be formulated mathematically in terms of the expected free energy for in active inference, that go beyond just attending to the most precise sensory information. I think for you mean both, and certainly when it comes to higher order and meta-attentional processes that you referred to, you can now think about deploying attention on the inside as an internal action. And some people actually exploit that in terms of the notion of mental action. So now you can actually have policies on the inside, covert actions, that now can be formulated in terms of what would be a salient deployment of attention. And this would be very, very close to your notion of meta-attention, attending to what to attend to, effect, or at least evaluating how I should internally prioritize or select various belief updating processes, usually in a hierarchical context, lower in my hierarchical model. So I think the clearest distinction between attention and salience is probably this explanation by Thomas Parr in the context of in this paper, which was Scientific Reports, Nature Scientific Reports, Working Memory, Attention, Salience and Active Inference by Thomas Parr. But this is somewhat restricted to discrete state space models. But one could imagine having similar arguments for predictive coding and continuous state space models. Don't want to go there yet. So pursuing this notion of meta-attention or attention as the deployment of precision of a likelihood mapping between the sensory input and representations and belief updating about the states of the affairs. What would meta-attention mean? Well, it would immediately require you to have a hierarchy of sense making or inference, or more simply a hierarchical generative model. And as soon as you've now got a hierarchical generative model, I think you've got the space in which to talk about sort of metacognition and action on the inside, mental action, and attention now as mental action. And the work of this person here, who was the winner of last year's MPE prize for this Thomas Metzinger project, is probably the best person to read. And what he does, again, he doesn't. This is an interesting account because it's a half narrative. Well, it's a narrative account, but does appeal to formalisms that inherit from active inference. But he, the first author himself, doesn't actually do simulations, so it might be the sort of style that you might want to adopt, in a chapter in one of your books, for example, that doesn't require you to actually do coding and simulations, but allows you to speak to the formalism that emerges under sort of hierarchical generative models under discrete state spaces. So he just takes you through various hierarchical or recursive or meta elaborations of a belief updating scheme under these generative models. But the key thing I just wanted to emphasize here, so if we just start with sort of a basic belief updating scheme, belief propagation or variational message passing scheme, here are the A spaces, if you like, which are the likelihood mappings that map from states of affairs S to observations. And one has to carefully select the precision of these things in the context where the precision actually matters. We then move on to the selection of the precisions of various sorts here by having an extra level to my model, which now can deploy precisions and recognize the context in which I now deploy my precisions, by having a third level, which he associates not with meta-attention but meta-awareness, and explicitly refers to mental action. So I think that this kind of formalism and possibly this kind of graphic would be a really useful way for you to link your A space to the mechanics of belief updating, not about so much the content, but about the mental actions that are required to optimize what you attend to through precision control, and what that implies for the structure of these generative models and the belief updating schemes of the Bayesian mechanics. And I think it fits very, very comfortably with your notion of meta-awareness meta-attention, and in so doing, I think connects directly to current accounts of phenomenology in this particular literature, which I repeat is largely first authored by Lars Sandved Smith, and that's in the Neuroscience of Consciousness, 2021. So another perspective on, I'm now coming back to, I'm just hoping I find, just to get rid of this. So this was a very early paper by Harriet Feldman, and by early I mean 2010, which was the paper introducing attention of this very simple precision of the likelihood kind through computational studies using the Posner paradigm, and also other accounts of attention in the neurosciences. One famous one which you might come across is something called the biased competition model. So this emphasizes that things are in competition within the field of attention, as it were, and you can look at the attentional selection as one particular focus winning that competition. I'm not sure it's a useful metaphor, but it's certainly one which was dominant in the 1990s to try and explain attention. So there may be some useful references here in just picking out neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience explanations for attention and how they relate to precision, uncertainty, and free energy from the perspective of active inference. So that's that one. So we can remove that one. Yeah, okay, that's no problem. I put this paper up here, which comes from this paper here. So this is a paper written with Vanya Weiss and Alan Hobson, called Sentience and the Origins of Consciousness from Cartesian Duality to Markovian Monism. The reason I've done that is just to really drill down on two issues which you discussed, which were first, this notion of forces. So I'm coming back now to this sort of technical picture where you want to now talk about the sort of the physics of attentional fields, and at least heuristically, attention being thought of in terms of forces in a field theoretic sense. And this just makes it very explicit that you can understand Bayesian belief updating as movement on a statistical manifold that is driven by the forces furnished by the free energy gradients. And that in turn, I think, provides a really nice opportunity for you to talk about what you talked about in very briefly, which is in this free energy landscape, you will have minima. And those minima, and they will obviously be moving in a dynamic context, as you say. But if we just think about a static context, those minima are the attractors. So you're now fully licensed to talk about dynamical systems theory, talk about attracting sets and attractors, open brackets, qualifying that these minima are always moving because we're in a dynamic context, but still all the theory holds that you would normally bring to the table from a dynamical systems theoretic perspective. And all that you are saying is that you can understand self-organization, the dynamics of self-organization as a gradient flow that can be interpreted as a force, and those forces are just literally the free energy gradients. Interestingly, if you drill down into the maths, you can always understand a free energy gradient or a force as a prediction error. And there are a number of ways of revealing that or unpacking that in discrete or continuous state space models. But from your point of view, you just want to make the point that all of this is about changing your mind about states of affairs out there in an optimal way that can always be expressed in terms of some forces that change your mind, and these can be cast simply as a gradient flow on a statistical manifold where the gradients are supplying the forces, and there's some interesting twists here in terms of conservative and dissipative aspects to these flows and dynamics, and you can get into sort of biorhythms and replication and the like in terms of the non-dissipative part. But I think from your point of view, it's just a question of putting that in play. This paper also makes the key point which I referred to previously. which is the whole point of the free energy principle, is that you now have this information geometry, which enables you to talk about changing your mind under these attentional fields in a way that you are changing your beliefs about something else apart from you. So there are two information geometries in play. There's the intrinsic geometry, which would be the thermodynamic information geometry or physics of neuronal activity itself. But because that neural activity can always be described as effectively engaged in a Bayesian mechanics or as self-evidencing or active inference, there's each state of the brain, or each path in terms of the neuronal dynamics, is associated with a probability distribution or density over everything else, over states of affairs, and that's the extrinsic and interesting information geometry where this applies. I thought this particular treatment would be apt for bringing in information geometry as the picture that you want to talk about, because it's got this notion of forcing movement, changing minds, states of affairs out there, that necessarily has to be the case to the extent you commit to the sort of classical physics version of the free energy principle. Incidentally, and this is not why I'm showing you this, but the argument made in this particular paper at the request of the editors was that this provides a kind of monism, a dual aspect monism, because you've got two information geometries, one which is the thermodynamics of neural activity, but the other one is the Bayesian mechanics of belief updating, both of which have a well-defined information geometry, which means you've got a dual aspect, two information geometries supervening on the same thing, which is you basically, or your embodied brain. So that I thought would be a useful bit of background reading, just to put the central role of information geometry in play. The reason I'm pressing on information geometry is that if you wanted, I noticed you wanted to cast it in terms of general relativity. I think you could pursue that. I'm not quite sure what your audience would be or who your readership would be, but if you wanted to go right back to your physics, I would recommend you go through the gauge theoretic route. And the reason I recommend that is that if you apply gauge theory to these information geometries, it transpires that the most important metric is the Fisher information metric that determines the information distance that you travel when you move on the statistical manifold. And that's really interesting from a number of perspectives that you mentioned. First of all, per unit universal law clock of time, that also scores the information rate, which means that it gives you a perception or representation of time and temporality in the future and the past, or how quickly the present is eluding you. Once you've got the information geometry to play with, you've now got notions of information length, information distance, and information rates at hand as you move from the center of your hypersphere towards the periphery, for example. The other reason it's really interesting, and I'll preempt why it's interesting, is that it's intimately related to attention. We're not talking. Where's it? Oh, here it is. Is that the Fisher information metric is just the curvature of your variational free energy. That curvature just is the precision. So there's a mathematical formal isomorphism or link between attention, the metric, the Fisher information metric on your that equips your M space with an information geometry, and attention. They're all they're all the same thing from different perspectives. And that's why I recommend this sort of gauge theoretic notion, but in the context of these unique geometries or spaces, which are statistical manifolds, not any arbitrary phase space, but the very special phase spaces where every point in phase space or state space is associated with the probability distribution. That now equips this space with the metric, which is the precision, which is effectively this elemental kind of attention. So that allows you to tell a story that that attention now, when you shift your focus of attention, then you are effectively, when you change your mind, the rate at which you are changing your mind is determined by the information distance or the information rate, which is associated with the uncertainty that your current beliefs have, and the inverse uncertainty just is the precision, and all sorts of interesting things fall out of that, even things like James's maximum caliper principle. So this was written for biologists. So it's meant to be a bit intuitive and a bit hand wavy, but I'm sure that you'll pick out of it what you want if you wanted to be slightly more formal in sort of joining the dots between attention, precision, and the metrics that define the information geometry that allow you to describe formally how one does belief updating, basic belief updating, or change your minds about states of affairs. So that was by Biswa Sengupta, who's now, I think, C-suite at JP Morgan, towards a neural gauge theory. I just threw this in as just a nod to authors such as Maxwell Ramstead and Axel Constant and others, just to celebrate your notion of this sort of shared narrative that at this higher level, that sort of things that we can attend to or can be aware of, have to be co-constructed, and there's been quite a lot written about that from that perspective by these group of theoreticians, largely in Montreal in Canada. So this is one example of that that may or may not speak to semiotics, deontic cues and fields of epistemic affordance. But I thought it'd be interesting for you just to read about this from the point of view of these ethological treatments. Oh yeah, just a nod. In all I've been talking about at the moment is in terms of common ground and shared narratives and the emergence of shared narratives in a shared world. If we have a shared world, then in some sense we have a sort of common, or we have unique sensory perspectives on a shared world that usually under joint free energy minimizing assumptions leads to a synchronization, a sharing of the generative model, the model that underwrites the M space. And that can be shown to be an emergent property of joint free energy minimization on joints, or minimizing mutual surprise. In the quantum information theoretic setting, that reads as alignment of quantum frames of reference. That can be in at least a sort of heuristic sense, and Chris is not here to confirm or disconfirm, but it can be read as a realization of the principle of unitarity, where everything becomes entangled. So if you want to use the separation between self and non-self, or self and other in this particular instance, as the holographic screen, then as two people in a dyadic interaction come to share the same narrative and to become mutually predictable and to become synchronized and coherent, that is the classical version of an expression of the principle of unitarity and the ultimate entanglement that obtains between the two bulks on either side of the holographic screen. And this is a paper by Chris and Mike, which just casts quantum reference frames in terms of neuronal hierarchies. In a classical context, that entanglement or the principle of unitarity emerges as synchronization of chaos or generalized synchronization, as illustrated by, in this paper, Active Inference Communication and Hermeneutics by myself and Chris Frith, who was an expert on theory of mind. Where was it now? In Cortex, apparently. Details will be there. And what we did was to simulate two songbirds talking to each other and generate and simulate using a predictive coding instantiation of the belief updating to show the emergence of the coherence that you were talking about, or in this instance, technically synchronization of chaos, which would be, if I repeat, the classical version of the entanglement that Chris would talk about. So this is not empirical evidence for communication through coherence, but it's sort of a mathematical treatment of that. The reason I want the second reason I put this up is that, interestingly, this synchronization only emerges with turn taking, and turn taking depends upon exactly the attentional mechanisms that we've just been talking about. So in effect, what I have to do, if we were co-locuting and exchanging, basically we're singing from the same narrative, singing from the same hymn sheet. And all I have to do is to infer whose turn it is. Once I've inferred whose turn it is, I can then either attend to or attenuate the consequences of my own singing. So if I want to listen, then I can attend to you. But I also have to, I preclude myself from talking. So I can't listen and sing. I can't listen and talk at the same time. So we have to also coordinate our attention. So it's not just a question of sharing a generative model. In actually communicating and synchronizing, we also have to synchronize our fields of attention. That wasn't discussed in any great depth in this paper, but just in this figure, the turn taking was schematically indicated by the different colors as there's a reciprocal switching of the attentional fields, or the precision weighting afforded the likelihood mappings in this particular instance. We've a similar treatment of a more narrative form. You mentioned flow states, and I just without wanting to overburden your reading, but just point you to some recent work by this young PhD student, Darius, here, helped by Lars Sandved Smith, who I repeat was the author of that meta-awareness hierarchical account of phenomenology under this sort of precision control version of attention. And they applied it, again, in a very narrative form to flow states. And I thought that might be interesting, given you mentioned flow. You also started talking towards the end about understanding psychopathology, or altered states of awareness or attentional deployment. And it is interesting to note that in my world, 99% of the computational accounts of psychiatric and neurological symptoms all focus on aberrant precision control, and therefore abnormal attention, effectively, which you would cast as a sort of a failure or disintegration of the attentional fields. And this is a review of the various perspectives on that, both neurophysiological, psychopharmacological, sort of computational, a perspective on the Bayesian brain, but really focusing on the importance of precision control, which, as I say, is, I think, the most elemental expression of your attentional fields. if you actually wanted to instantiate that in silico. And the reason I'm putting this paper here, as I did actually yesterday by coincidence, is it's got about 200 sort of canonical references in this space. But I repeat, remember why I'm showing this paper, that all psychopathology can be reduced to precision control, and precision control just is the control of your attentional fields. So I think that's why I started off by saying there are lots of people who be stakeholders in deploying any insights or mechanics or procedures or frameworks in a therapeutic context, because nearly all psychopathology can be understood in terms of the failure at this kind of level, either attentional or meta-attentional. And that's it. So I can now stop sharing, having exhausted myself and you, I am sure.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Professor Friston, for your generosity in sharing your time and that much guidance. In I'm gonna have to watch that multiple times and read the transcript, and also read those papers you pointed out to me. I couldn't appreciate it more. I'm really truly grateful for your generosity. Thank you.
Oh no, thank you for exciting and excellent discussion and a stream of consciousness from me at the end. At this point, Peter now asks us to applaud you again, that we can go away and have a nice cigarette and a cup of tea.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you. Thank you for inviting me, and
So
hope I see you soon.
So I see we have a hand raised, but maybe you can just write an email to the chair's chief, and I'll just say thank you, Thomas. And as Carl magically predicted, I'll also ask us all to one last time unmute our microphones and give you a last round of applause. Thank you. All right, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day, and all the best.
You too. Blessings. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.